The cockpit trembled as the engine settled into a narrow band of vibration that spoke of effort rather than strain. Air thinned with altitude, though the pilot felt it less in breath than in pressure behind the eyes and in the way sound sharpened. Ahead, the sky was no longer open space. It was occupied territory. Shapes moved within it with confidence born from familiarity. Wings banked with reflex, not calculation. The opposing formation did not hunt cautiously. It expected dominance. The prevailing assumption was already written into every movement above and below. This encounter was not meant to last. The fighter carried expectations like ballast. Its design had been judged unfavorably in prior engagements. Reports described it as heavy where others were light, slow to respond where agility defined survival. Against the aircraft it faced, doctrine predicted a brief outcome. The Zero had come to represent an idea more than a machine. It was treated as an extension of inevitability. Tight turns, rapid climbs, a style of combat taught and reinforced until it became reflex. Pilots learned not merely how to fight, but how to fight one way. Everything outside that pattern was framed as error. Contact closed quickly. The sky compressed into vectors and converging arcs. Tracers cut through air that seemed to resist them. The first pass followed expectation. Turns tightened, angles collapsed. The Zero moved as it was meant to move. The American fighter responded as doctrine advised, and immediately began to fall behind the geometry of the fight. Control inputs demanded more than they returned. The machine lagged in the tight circle where performance charts promised defeat. The separation between assumption and reality narrowed until it became physical. The pilot felt the imbalance not as fear, but as confirmation. The training had not been wrong. It had simply been complete in one context and useless in another. The aircraft could not win where victory had been defined narrowly. Persisting along that path would resolve nothing. The pressure of the engagement did not allow time for reconsideration in abstract terms. There was only response, and response had already failed once. What followed broke the visible pattern without announcing itself. The fighter did not tighten its turn. It did not chase advantage within the established spiral. Instead, it disengaged from the geometry entirely. Nose dropped, throttle opened. The motion appeared binary to observers. One moment inside the fight, the next leaving it. To those trained to read aerial engagements through dogfighting arcs, the move registered as surrender or error. The Zero followed instinctively, confident that escape could not be sustained. Speed replaced rotation. The airframe stabilized into a regime where mass and power mattered more than lightness and turn rate. Forces distributed differently. Control surfaces met resistance they had been designed to handle. The engine settled into a sustained output that the aircraft could maintain without compromise. The fighter did not try to outturn its opponent. It withdrew from the contest over angles and entered a contest over energy that doctrine had taught only incompletely. The Zero pilot encountered unfamiliar conditions. The distance between aircraft increased and decreased along a line rather than a circle. Closure rates changed unpredictably. The assumptions that govern timing in a traditional dogfight no longer applied. Attempts to regain positional advantage required maneuvers that bled the very quality upon which previous dominance relied. The engagement extended rather than resolved, and extension itself began to shift probability. Inside the cockpit, the pilot measured progress not by position, but by behavior. The Zero no longer pressed confidently into firing range. It hesitated at thresholds it had previously ignored. Turns widened. Corrections took longer. The moment the fight stopped obeying the expected grammar, the advantage inherited from doctrine began to erode. The machine that had been dismissed as hopeless entered a context where its supposed weaknesses no longer defined outcome. Gravity became an ally only insofar as it was accepted, not exploited theatrically. Descents were controlled. Climbs were chosen sparingly. Every decision minimized unnecessary loss of energy. The fighter remained fast because it refused to become slow. In abandoning dogfighting altogether, the pilot did not invent a trick so much as remove constraints that had governed thinking about aerial combat. The Zero could still turn. It could still climb. What it could not do indefinitely was control the terms of engagement, once those terms no longer rewarded its strengths exclusively. The duel did not end abruptly. It diluted. Separation increased. Opportunities narrowed. The Zero disengaged not because it had been defeated in the accepted sense, but because pursuit no longer promised resolution. The effort required to close distance outweighed the diminishing certainty of advantage. The fight dissolved into sky that once again appeared open, though it carried the residue of a broken assumption. Afterward, analysis struggled to name the moment when advantage changed hands. There was no single maneuver to mark it, no dramatic reversal. What became clear only in hindsight was that the engagement had ended the instant dogfighting ceased to define success. By stepping outside that expectation, the pilot had not beaten the Zero at its own game. He had removed the game itself. In formal terms, the tactic appeared obvious only after it had been demonstrated. Energy retention, controlled extension, refusal to accept turning contests against superior turners. These principles existed in technical literature. They did not exist in habit. Habit favored the visible contest, the dramatic exchange of angles that could be taught and evaluated easily. What could not be evaluated as easily was restraint under pressure, the decision not to engage where engagement promised loss. The aircraft itself played its part silently. Its weight, condemned in earlier assessments, contributed to stability at speed. Its engine delivered sustained output where lighter designs favored bursts. Its control surfaces responded predictably when not forced into extremes they had never been optimized for. None of these qualities were new. They had simply been undervalued because doctrine privileged a narrower definition of combat. Word of such engagements circulated unevenly. They did not conform neatly to reports that ranked success by victories in traditional dogfights. Yet patterns emerged across theaters where pilots abandoned turning battles and survived encounters that doctrine had deemed unwinnable. Survivability, once dismissed as secondary to aggression, began to acquire tactical weight. Each aircraft that returned intact carried experience that refinement alone could not produce. The change did not arrive as formal declaration. It arrived as adjustment. Pilots altered entry angles. They disengaged earlier. They treated speed as reserve rather than expendable resource. Opponents accustomed to encounters resolving within familiar geometries encountered fights that stretched time and space unpredictably. The Zero remained lethal. Its capabilities did not diminish. What changed was the environment in which those capabilities operated. By removing dogfighting from the center of aerial engagement, pilots forced a recalibration of expectation. The Zero could not impose its strengths universally once adversaries refused to meet it where it excelled. The sky no longer guaranteed symmetry. It became uneven, shaped by choices rather than doctrine. What had been dismissed as hopeless proved sustainable when reframed. The fighter did not overthrow the Zero through superiority of design. It survived by aligning its behavior with its own tolerances and refusing to accept assumptions that no longer matched conditions. In doing so, it altered the practical balance of air combat incrementally, shift by shift, without ever declaring that it had done so. The implications of these encounters did not register immediately within formal evaluation systems. Reports continued to categorize engagements in familiar terms, emphasizing kills, losses, and visible exchanges. What resisted capture was the absence of outcome where one had been expected. A fight that dissolved without resolution did not fit neatly into established metrics. Yet the accumulation of such encounters began to exert pressure on interpretation itself, forcing planners and instructors to acknowledge a growing discrepancy between predicted outcomes and observed survivability. Training syllabi shifted subtly rather than dramatically. Emphasis on turning contests did not disappear, but it was repositioned as conditional rather than universal. Pilots were encouraged to read aircraft behavior as systems with distinct operating envelopes, rather than as participants in a singular style of combat. This reframing privileged understanding of energy states, relative momentum, and the cost of correction over the elegance of maneuver. The sky became a domain of management rather than contest. The Zero remained a benchmark. Its reputation did not collapse. Instead, it became contextual. Against pilots who accepted its preferred geometry, it retained superiority. Against those who denied that geometry, its advantages became localized rather than absolute. This distinction mattered. It meant that outcome no longer depended solely on matching skill within the same framework, but on selecting which framework would govern the engagement at all. From an engineering perspective, the reassessment was equally restrained. Designers did not abandon pursuit of agility. They reconsidered its role relative to endurance, speed maintenance, and structural tolerance. Aircraft evaluations began to privilege not just peak performance, but performance sustainability under prolonged stress. Airframes that could carry momentum without degrading control provided pilots with options beyond immediate confrontation. These options translated directly into survivability when doctrine alone offered none. Psychologically, the shift demanded a recalibration of restraint. Pilots trained to close, press, and finish learned instead to delay, extend, and disengage without interpreting withdrawal as failure. This discipline proved difficult precisely because it appeared passive. The absence of immediate reward challenged impulses reinforced through earlier phases of the war. Yet those who adopted the approach found that patience altered the opponent's behavior as reliably as aggression. Fights slowed, errors surfaced elsewhere. Certainty eroded. Opposing forces responded unevenly. Some units adapted, widening their expectations of engagement and adjusting pursuit behavior accordingly. Others continued to press within established patterns, attributing unresolved encounters to circumstance rather than structure. The latter group found itself increasingly expending effort without closure. Each such expenditure carried cost in fuel, fatigue, and opportunity elsewhere. Over time, these costs accumulated into pressure that no amount of confidence could fully offset. What emerged was not a new doctrine articulated in clear terms, but an expanded operational vocabulary. Pilots operated with greater awareness of when not to fight, and more importantly, how not to fight. Refusal became tool rather than failure. The sky, once framed as arena, came to be understood as medium with properties that could be exploited through compliance as much as confrontation. The fighter once labeled hopeless achieved influence not through dominance, but through survival repeated often enough to demand recognition. Each intact return reinforced the principle that engagements could be shaped by subtraction rather than addition. By removing turning combat from the equation, pilots stripped away assumptions their opponents relied upon, leaving them to operate within diminishing informational clarity. The broader conflict absorbed this lesson gradually. As air combat matured, certainty declined as an organizing principle. Encounters became less binary. Victory and loss were no longer the only meaningful outcomes. Persistence gained ground as strategic factor, particularly in environments where production, rotation, and replacement operated at industrial scale. Survival extended presence. Presence imposed planning burden. That burden translated into distributed pressure beyond any single engagement. In this sense, the abandonment of dogfighting represented more than a tactical adjustment. It reflected an emerging understanding of modern combat as system interaction rather than duel. Systems rewarded behavior that minimized exposure to their strongest feedback loops. Those who refused to participate in highly optimized exchanges forced their opponents into inefficiencies that power alone could not resolve. The Zero continued to fly. It continued to kill. Its pilots remained skilled and dangerous. What changed was the assumption that its strengths could be imposed universally. Once that assumption faltered, advantage required alignment rather than assertion. The pilot who stopped dogfighting did not defeat the Zero in legend or spectacle. He diminished its certainty, and in doing so, he contributed quietly to a transformation in how air power understood itself, replacing inevitability with condition and dominance with dependency on choices made under pressure rather than reflex alone. This transformation did not arrive as revelation, but as accumulation. Each sortie that ended without engagement, each chase that dispersed without result, contributed incrementally to a recalibration of expectation. Pilots began to internalize the idea that success could be achieved without compression of distance or exchange of fire. The refusal to conform to anticipated patterns created a form of negative space within combat, an absence that opponents struggled to interpret and even more struggled to counter through escalation alone. At the level of command, this absence complicated assessment. Victory required confirmation, and confirmation depended on interaction. When interaction declined, planners were left to interpret silence. Some read it as evasion. Others dismissed it as weather, fatigue, or chance. Few recognized it immediately as an artifact of choice made deliberately within the cockpit. The concept that a pilot might reshape engagement by limiting participation challenged long-held beliefs about initiative and control in aerial warfare. Operationally, the implications extended beyond individual aircraft. Formation behavior adjusted. Wingmen were briefed not solely on mutual coverage during turns, but on spacing during extensions. Escorts learned to hold posture rather than compress instinctively. Intercepts became exercises in pressure management rather than decisive closure. The air battle stretched spatially and temporally, favoring platforms that could remain stable under prolonged load. This shift exposed friction within established hierarchies of skill. Pilots, celebrated for aggression, faced moments where restraint determined outcome. Those accustomed to leading through boldness encountered situations where leadership meant denying opportunity rather than seizing it. The culture of air combat, long shaped by the imagery of pursuit and kill, absorbed this contradiction slowly. Adaptation came not through speeches or manuals, but through redistribution of survivability across squadrons. Opponents experienced the change differently. For those relying on rapid convergence and decisive geometry, denial created uncertainty that could not be resolved through technique alone. Each attempt to force engagement extended exposure and consumed advantage. Errors emerged not from lack of skill, but from impatience. The sky offered no reinforcement for intensity beyond its limits. Instead, it punished persistence that exceeded informational return. Technically, aircraft behavior under these conditions reinforced the lesson. Engines operated more consistently when flows stabilized. Control responses remained predictable when extremes were avoided. Structural were distributed evenly rather than concentrating under aggressive maneuver. These mechanical truths supported the broader operational shift, aligning material performance with tactical philosophy. Endurance was no longer merely tolerated. It was rewarded through reliability. The fighter once dismissed as inadequate proved compatible with this environment, not because its deficiencies vanished, but because its strengths aligned with restraint. It maintained energy without demanding extreme correction. It absorbed stress without signaling weakness. In refusing to compete on unfavorable terms, it transformed limitation into boundary and boundary into protection. As engagements continued across theaters, this pattern influenced how air superiority was contested. Dominance became less about imposing presence everywhere and more about shaping how and when interaction occurred. Denial joined engagement as legitimate means of control. The airspace itself became a tool, offering gradients of risk rather than absolute states of advantage or defeat. Over time, this understanding filtered back into development and procurement indirectly. Designers observed operational patterns without always naming their causes. They prioritized stability under load, responsiveness without fragility, and performance envelopes that rewarded conservation rather than spikes. These choices reflected lessons learned not from triumph, but from survival repeated without spectacle. The pilot who abandoned dogfighting did not invalidate tradition. He exposed its conditional nature. Close combat remained effective when circumstances favored it. What changed was the belief that it was unavoidable. Choice re-entered the equation. With choice came agency distinct from aggression. In the broader calculus of the war, this agency mattered. It redistributed loss rates. It altered engagement frequency. It stretched adversary resources by preserving threats that could not be eliminated decisively. Each unresolved encounter forced planning to account for persistence rather than closure. This persistence accumulated pressure outward into logistics, scheduling, and morale. The sky, as ever, remained indifferent. It rewarded alignment with its properties rather than adherence to doctrine. Those who understood this did not seek to overpower it. They operated within it, minimizing demand and maximizing tolerance. In doing so, they shifted the balance subtly, not through dominance, but through duration. The fighter that once seemed hopeless did not become superior. It became sufficient, and sufficiency, sustained across repeated encounters, proved influential enough to reshape expectations on both sides of the engagement. The war absorbed this influence quietly, through altered behavior rather than proclaimed victory, leaving behind a legacy not of triumph, but of method refined by refusal to fight where fighting promised nothing but predictable loss. That refusal did not negate courage. It reframed it. Courage became the willingness to remain exposed to judgment, to criticism, and to uncertainty while resisting the impulse to seek validation through immediate confrontation. In the cockpit, this translated to a different relationship with threat. Danger was not something to be rushed toward or away from. It was a condition to be managed through position, duration, and discipline. The pilot accepted that safety did not emerge from dominance alone, but from controlling the terms under which interaction could occur. Training absorbed this shift informally. Instructors described scenarios without prescribing a single correct reaction. They emphasized energy states, spacing, and exit options over closure. Students learned to recognize when engagement favored the opponent and when avoidance could be transformed into advantage through persistence. These lessons were not codified as doctrine at first. They circulated as cautionary insights, reinforced by survival rather than instruction. Opposing air forces faced a more subtle challenge. Traditional measures of success depended on visible outcomes. Engagements that dissolved without contact complicated both assessment and morale. Pilots returned reporting pursuit without confirmation, presence without exchange. The absence of decisive encounters strained narratives built around superiority. It forced leaders to explain why pressure did not automatically yield results and why opportunity sometimes vanished without warning. The strain extended to logistics and planning. Aircraft expected to deliver results through interception cycles instead remained committed longer, consuming fuel and attention without producing measurable effect. Patrol zones required wider coverage to account for adversaries who refused to condense engagements. This diffusion reduced intensity elsewhere, redistributing resources across a battle space, defined increasingly by uncertainty rather than control. Psychologically, the shift unsettled assumptions about initiative. The side applying pressure discovered that initiative could be declined, not resisted directly, not reversed in dramatic fashion, but simply unmet. Without reciprocal action, effort plateaued. This imbalance favored those willing to let time accumulate rather than escalate. It placed a premium on patience that many systems were not designed to value explicitly. Within this context, the act of not dogfighting became more than avoidance. It became a filter. Only engagements that favored the chosen geometry were accepted. Others were allowed to decay. Over repeated encounters, this selectivity reshaped loss distributions. Survivability improved not through superiority in every moment, but through refusal to participate in moments where disadvantage was inevitable. Aircraft designs that aligned with this philosophy proved resilient. They did not need to exceed opponents in every metric. They needed to remain predictable under sustained conditions and to preserve margin when impulses tempted excess. The pilot relied on this predictability to maintain posture rather than to seek advantage through abrupt transformation. Machine and operator converged around conservation as operational principle. This convergence altered how success was recognized internally. Victories became less visible but more durable. Completion of a mission without engagement was no longer dismissed automatically. It was evaluated for strategic impact in terms of pressure applied and attention consumed. The presence of an aircraft that could not be drawn into disadvantage imposed planning costs disproportionate to its immediate activity. Across time, these costs compounded. The opponent was forced to account for threats that did not resolve themselves decisively. Airspace could not be declared secure simply because no engagement had occurred. Uncertainty lingered, extending its influence beyond the moment of contact. This uncertainty functioned as constraint, shaping behavior on both sides. The fighter that disabled dogfighting did not redefine combat by negating traditional skills. It redefined choice within combat. By narrowing the conditions under which engagement occurred, it shifted the burden outward. The opponent had to decide whether to continue pursuit without assurance of payoff or to disengage and reallocate effort elsewhere. Either outcome favored the one who endured. Such influence rarely enters official narratives. It lacks the clarity of destruction and the immediacy of triumph. It persists in operational memory, transmitted through altered habits and expectations rather than documented instruction. Squadrons adapt quietly. Commanders adjust thresholds. The rhythm of conflict changes without announcement. In this way, the act of stopping dogfighting did not produce a single turning point. It produced a gradient. Over many encounters, it softened the certainty with which air combat could be forced into decisive geometry. It reminded both sides that the sky does not reward insistence indefinitely, and that control is not always achieved through acceleration toward contact. The war continued. Technologies advanced. Tactics evolved in parallel. Yet beneath these developments remained a lasting imprint. The recognition that refusal could function as tactic, that restraint could impose limits on aggression, and that endurance within defined boundaries could reshape engagement without spectacle. This imprint did not overturn the logic of air combat. It tempered it. In the end, the fighter judged hopeless did not prevail by confronting expectation head-on. It prevailed by narrowing the space in which expectation could operate. By denying the opponent the familiar exchange, it forced adaptation on terms that diluted advantage. The result did not announce itself as victory. It endured quietly, measured in the continued presence of aircraft that returned not celebrated, but intact. And in conflicts measured by capacity to continue, that integrity mattered. That integrity carried forward beyond individual sorties. It influenced planning cycles and training assumptions long after the immediate conditions that had produced it passed. Air combat became understood less as a sequence of inevitable engagements and more as a field of conditional interactions, governed by margins and persistence rather than by dramatic reversals. The fighter that had been dismissed retained its limitations. It did not become dominant in every context. What changed was the interpretation of those limitations. They were no longer treated as liabilities that demanded compensation through aggression, but as boundaries within which reliable outcomes could be achieved. As this understanding settled, it altered how losses were anticipated. Attrition was no longer framed solely as a result of inferior performance in confrontation, but as consequence of decision-making under pressure. Avoidance, once equated with failure, acquired legitimacy when paired with sustainability. The ability to return repeatedly without decisive engagement imposed asymmetrical cost. It consumed enemy attention while conserving one's own capacity. Over time, that imbalance shaped the tempo of operations more subtly than any single encounter could have. For those applying pressure from above, the change was unsettling. Familiar indicators of progress blurred. Patrols concluded without confirmation. Effort expended did not correlate cleanly with outcome achieved. Command structures accustomed to interpreting activity as advantage were forced to accommodate stretches of ambiguity. This ambiguity did not signal defeat, but it eroded confidence and certainty. When certainty weakened, insistence followed less reliably. What mattered in these shifts was not the brilliance of isolated individuals, but the cumulative effect of repeated decisions aligned with endurance. Each time an engagement dissolved without result, it reinforced a pattern. That pattern shaped expectations on both sides, constraining some behaviors while enabling others. It encouraged restraint where escalation once felt automatic. It normalized patience in systems designed to reward speed. The air war did not pivot on this alone. No single tactic bore that weight. But this adjustment threaded through broader developments, interacting with evolving technologies and expanding operational scales. As detection improved and engagement ranges extended, the value of refusing unfavorable geometry increased. Systems that demanded immediate closure risked overstretch. Systems that preserved margin endured longer. In this environment, the legacy of abandoning dogfighting was not measured in victories claimed, but in options preserved. The fighter once judged unsuited for combat against a particular enemy remained operationally relevant because it narrowed the circumstances under which disadvantage could be imposed upon it. It forced opponents to accept either prolonged uncertainty or dispersal of effort. Both outcomes carried cost. This legacy persisted quietly. It did not require endorsement or codification to function. It lived in altered reflexes and adjusted planning margins. Pilots learned to prioritize position over spectacle. Commanders learned to accept unresolved outcomes as acceptable when weighed against sustainability. These shifts accumulated into doctrine without ever being declared as such. In conflicts where dominance is often understood through visibility, this represented a different form of influence. It taught that control could be exercised by limiting engagement rather than by forcing it. That sometimes the refusal to participate fully in expected forms of battle imposed greater constraint than participation ever could. The sky, like the sea, did not reward insistence indefinitely. Thus, the fighter deemed hopeless altered its relationship to the war not by disproving every criticism leveled against it, but by operating in a way that made those criticisms less relevant. It did not neg a threat. It managed it. It did not seek to overwhelm. It endured. And in wars of attrition and attention, Endurance shaped outcomes as surely as destruction. The record of these encounters bears no dramatic punctuation. There is no moment where expectation shatters visibly. Instead, there is gradual recalibration. The space where certainty once lived grows smaller. Decisions become more conditional. Pressure redistributes itself without declaration. In that redistribution lies the true impact of refusing to fight on terms imposed by the opponent. When viewed across time, this shift stands as part of a larger pattern evident throughout the conflict. Systems optimized for decisive engagement encountered limits imposed by environment, material tolerance, and human endurance. Where those systems adjusted, they persisted. Where they insisted, they paid increasing cost for diminishing clarity. The practice of disengagement without collapse reflected that broader lesson. In the end, stopping dogfighting did not remove combat from the sky. It changed how combat occupied it. It made space for duration to matter alongside maneuver, for conservation to rival aggression. It reminded those who sought certainty through force that certainty itself had conditions. And when those conditions could not be met, persistence quietly asserted a different form of control. The war moved on, absorbing these adjustments without commentary. Aircraft came and went. Tactics evolved. Yet beneath these changes remained the enduring truth that not every contest could be forced to resolve through confrontation alone. Some were shaped instead by endurance, by patience sustained under threat, and by the willingness to accept ambiguity when clarity could not be compelled. That acceptance did not win headlines. It did not define legends. It returned aircraft intact and pilots alive. And in doing so, it influenced a conflict measured not only by moments of destruction, but by capacity to continue. Above the front lines, this capacity to continue without immediate resolution began to matter as much as tactical success. Each aircraft that returned, without having been forced into disadvantage, preserved options for future encounters. Each patrol that concluded without loss reshaped expectations about what effective engagement looked like. Over time, this accumulated into a subtle but real shift in how air superiority was interpreted. It can no longer be measured solely by kills or forced engagements. It also had to account for who imposed tempo, who dictated conditions, and who endured without being compelled to react. For opposing forces, this proved frustrating in ways that were difficult to articulate within existing frameworks. An enemy that refused to behave as expected could not be reliably ranked or neutralized. The absence of dramatic outcomes complicated reporting and assessment. Effort expended yielded fewer tangible indicators of progress. This gap between activity and results strained systems that depended on measurable returns to validate continued pressure. The response was often escalation in form rather than in effect. More patrols, tighter spacing, increased vigilance. Yet each layer added complexity that demanded greater coordination and placed additional strain on logistics and personnel. None of it guaranteed resolution. In many cases, it simply prolonged exposure while preserving uncertainty. The fighter that avoided dogfighting became not just a tactical problem, but an operational irritant, absorbing attention disproportionate to its apparent threat. This imbalance echoed patterns seen elsewhere in the war, where systems optimized for decisive action encountered opponents willing to operate within narrower margins for longer periods. Endurance did not defeat power directly. It diluted it. By refusing to provide opportunities for clear engagement, it forced adversaries to commit resources without assurance of payoff. Over time, such commitments reshaped priorities and constrained flexibility. From the cockpit, the experience remained unremarkable. There were no moments designed for memory. Decisions were procedural, guided by limits and probabilities rather than instinctive aggression. The emphasis stayed on maintaining altitude margins, energy states, and separation rather than pursuing advantage through risk. Survival depended on consistency, not brilliance. The absence of error mattered more than the presence of daring. As this approach persisted, it altered how pilots related to the concept of victory. Victory became less about immediate domination and more about denial. Preventing the enemy from imposing terms counted as success, even if nothing decisive occurred. Each safe return accumulated as quiet proof that the engagement had failed to resolve on hostile terms. This redefinition did not replace traditional measures. It supplemented them, expanding the range of acceptable outcomes. Command structures adapted unevenly. Some embraced ambiguity as inevitable. Others resisted, seeking to restore clarity through renewed emphasis on confrontation. The tension between these impulses shaped strategic discussions without always resolving them. Neither side could fully abandon its assumptions. What changed was the space between them, filled increasingly by conditional judgments rather than absolutes. Technological development reinforced this shift indirectly. Improvements in speed, range, and detection expanded the potential for engagement, but also increased the cost of error. What once could be corrected through aggressive maneuver now carried higher stakes. Under these conditions, restraint gained value. The choice to disengage early preserved assets that could be redeployed where conditions proved more favorable. This logic aligned naturally with the practice of avoiding dogfighting, reinforcing its persistence. The cumulative effect reached beyond individual units. Training emphasized judgment over reflex. Simulation scenarios rewarded survival under constraint rather than spectacular reversal. Evaluation criteria broadened to include mission completion without loss as legitimate success. None of this eliminated the demand for aggression when necessary. It contextualized it, ensuring that force was applied where it promised disproportionate return rather than where expectation alone demanded it. In this way, what began as adaptation to a specific imbalance evolved into a more general appreciation of endurance as operational currency. The skies filled with aircraft whose greatest contribution lay not in what they destroyed, but in what they denied. Denial constrained adversary planning, extended threat horizons, and complicated concentration of effort. It redistributed risk upward, forcing those seeking decisive engagement to accept prolonged exposure or withdrawal without conclusion. Such dynamics rarely registered as turning points. They did not announce themselves through communiques or victories claimed. They emerged through changed behavior that became routine before it was fully understood. Over time, this routine exerted influence greater than any single engagement could have achieved, shaping how air combat was approached across theaters. The fighter once labeled hopeless thus assumed a role defined not by dominance, but by persistence. It existed as a reminder that viability did not always equate to superiority, and that survival itself could shape outcomes when repeated consistently. The refusal to dogfight did not eliminate confrontation. It transformed it into something less visible and harder to resolve, governed by duration rather than spectacle. As the conflict continued and resources stretched, these effects compounded. Systems optimized for certainty faced increasing numbers of situations where certainty could not be obtained at reasonable cost. Each instance demanded choice: escalate without assurance or disengage without closure. The very existence of this choice altered behavior, moderating aggression and redistributing attention. In the broader arc of the war, this moderation mattered. It preserved capability across extended periods. It allowed forces to endure attritional environments without catastrophic loss. It reinforced the principle that not every challenge could be met through confrontation alone, and that sometimes refusing to fight on imposed terms yielded the most sustainable advantage. The record, when examined closely, reveals this quiet influence running beneath more dramatic narratives. It shows how adaptation rooted in restraint shaped operational reality without ever demanding recognition. The fighter survived, the pilot returned, the engagement dissolved, and over time, that pattern reshaped expectations about what air combat required to endure. When measured not in moments, but in months and years, such shifts accumulate into strategic effect. They constrain opponents, preserve options, and extend capacity. They do so silently, without the punctuation of victory or defeat. In that silence lies their significance. And so, in skies crowded with machines and intent, the decision to stop dogfighting stands not as an act of withdrawal, but as alignment with a different logic of war. A logic where pressure does not always compel, where endurance competes with aggression, and where the ability to continue quietly can matter as much as the ability to prevail openly. In that logic, the war was shaped not only by clashes that ended decisively, but by those that ended without conclusion. By aircraft that returned intact, denying resolution. By pilots who chose margin over moment. And by systems forced to adapt to the reality that control could be constrained not just by force, but by the refusal to be drawn into its expected use. What followed these unresolved encounters was not immediate doctrine, but gradual accommodation. Commanders learned to read absence as signal. A patrol that failed to produce engagement was no longer dismissed as uneventful. It was evaluated for what it implied about enemy behavior and about the ratio between exertion and return. Each such evaluation fed into planning cycles that increasingly accounted for uncertainty as a persistent condition rather than a temporary inconvenience. For pilots, this translated into a different relationship with risk. Aggression remained available, but it was no longer the default expression of competence. Competence became situational, defined by the ability to interpret when force would yield advantage and when it would only satisfy expectation. The discipline required to disengage deliberately, to maintain separation, to preserve altitude and energy without seeking closure, demanded equal mastery. It rewarded familiarity with limits rather than reliance on instinct alone. These decisions accumulated at scale. Airspace became less predictable as engagement stretched without decisive outcome. Patrol patterns adjusted. Escort behavior grew more conservative where experience suggested diminishing returns. The presence of aircraft that refused dogfighting imposed hesitation in opponents, not because it threatened annihilation, but because it complicated calculation. A target that could not be forced into error consumed time disproportionate to its apparent value. Material endurance supported this shift. Aircraft constructed with margins that tolerated sustained stress allowed pilots to operate within narrow envelopes without degradation. Maintenance cycles adapted to support extended utilization rather than rapid turnover driven by attrition. The infrastructure of air war adjusted subtly, reinforcing behaviors that favored continuity over gamble. Each intact airframe carried forward opportunity that loss would have foreclosed. The effect was cumulative and uneven. Some units embraced restraint readily. Others clung to established narratives that equated engagement with progress. Over time, experience exerted pressure where orders could not. Squadrons with higher survival rates maintained operational effectiveness longer. Those that pursued confrontation reflexively suffered depletion that reduced their ability to influence later phases of the conflict. This disparity did not resolve into ideology. It surfaced as differential capacity. At higher levels, the implication proved uncomfortable. Planning models built around decisive engagements struggled to incorporate denial as outcome. Metrics evolved slowly, lagging behind practice. Yet behavior changed regardless. Resources shifted toward missions that promised clarity and away from those that consumed effort without resolution. This redistribution altered the shape of operations across regions, concentrating force selectively rather than universally. The refusal to dogfight thus became part of a broader pattern in mature warfare. As systems grew more complex and environments less forgiving, the cost of forcing resolution increased. Endurance offered a way to operate within that complexity without amplifying risk. It did not promise dominance. It preserved viability. That preservation, repeated often enough, shaped strategic balance indirectly but persistently. Opponents adapted in turn, seeking new methods to compel engagement. Yet each adaptation encountered the same constraint. Confirmation required cooperation from the environment and from the behavior of the target. When both resisted, escalation produced diminishing informational value. The cycle reinforced itself, teaching caution even where doctrine had not yet conceded ground. This interplay extended beyond individual aircraft and pilots. It influenced how airspace was controlled, how resources were allocated, and how success was defined under conditions of extended conflict. Absolute superiority gave way to relative advantage measured over time rather than moments. Systems that could endure ambiguity gained leverage over systems that demanded closure. In retrospect, the fighter once dismissed as hopeless assumed significance, not because it reversed a single engagement, but because it embodied this logic consistently. It demonstrated that refusing to engage on imposed terms could conserve strength and impose cost simultaneously. Each instance in which it returned intact deprived the opponent of closure and extended uncertainty forward in time. Such influence rarely appeared in celebratory accounts. It lacked spectacle. It offered no dramatic reversal. Yet it shaped outcomes by constraining behavior and by redistributing effort. Where one side demanded reaction to validate belief, the other side withheld reaction and allowed belief to erode under its own weight. In the long view, this erosion mattered. It moderated expectations of control and tempered reliance on aggression as a universal solution. It underscored the reality that environments impose their own limits on force, and that adaptation often favors those willing to accept those limits rather than resist them continuously. Thus, the decision to stop dogfighting did not signal weakness. It signaled transition, a move from contest defined by moments to one defined by duration, from resolution sought through confrontation to advantage accumulated through persistence. It aligned tactics with conditions rather than with tradition. As the war pressed on, such alignments increasingly separated forces that endured from those that expended themselves seeking certainty. In skies dense with possibility and constraint, endurance proved capable of shaping the conflict quietly, narrowing options, and stretching the timeline beyond what opponents preferred. The fighter survived. The pilot returned. The engagement remained unresolved. And in that unresolved state, pressure shifted subtly upward, obliging systems built on decisive action to contend with a reality where not every encounter could be forced to conclusion. The persistence of this pattern gradually reshaped how uncertainty itself was treated within air operations. What had once been considered an interim condition to be eliminated became an environment to be managed. This distinction altered command behavior in ways that were not immediately visible, but increasingly consequential. Decisions favored continuity over assertion, knowing that sustained presence carried influence independent of decisive engagement. In practice, this meant airframes were committed with a clearer understanding of when not to press. Pilots were trusted to disengage without stigma. Survival without contact ceased to be interpreted as missed opportunity. It became recognized as the preservation of leverage. Each aircraft that remained operational extended the shadow it cast across contested airspace, forcing opponents to account for its potential without ever compelling it into view. This recognition did not arrive uniformly. It emerged through accumulation of experience in which attempts to force outcomes repeatedly failed to deliver proportionate advantage. Units that adapted earliest conserved strength and flexibility. Those that resisted adaptation paid in attrition and fatigue. Over time, the disparity imposed its own logic on planning. Allocation followed survivability. Endurance became a criterion, even when it was not explicitly stated. The opposing response remained constrained by the same structural demands. Aircraft designed for decisive confrontation required engagement to justify their commitment. Patrols interpreted absence as inefficiency. Pressure was reapplied in varied forms, but each iteration encountered the same diminishing returns. Escalation saturated the medium without restoring clarity. The cycle continued until withdrawal appeared more rational than persistence, even when no conclusion had been reached. At that point, the refusal to dogfight achieved its effect, not by defeating the adversary, but by exhausting justification. Once continuation no longer promised resolution, disengagement followed. The sequence did not resemble victory. It resembled closure deferred indefinitely. That deferral extended beyond the immediate encounter, coloring expectations for subsequent operations. Across multiple theaters, similar dynamics surfaced. Mature systems confronted environments that resisted linear dominance. The more completely these systems sought to assert control, the more complexity they generated. Each additional input compounded interference rather than resolving it. In such conditions, restraint achieved what escalation could not. It stabilized position where motion only multiplied uncertainty. This logic placed unusual value on discipline. Not the discipline of attack, but the discipline of omission. The ability to refrain from action when action was expected demanded confidence in design margins and in collective purpose. It required trust that survival itself served strategic ends, even when those ends were not immediately apparent. Over time, this trust reshaped operational culture. Training emphasized patience alongside aggression. Judgment was valued for what it withheld as much as for what it applied. Units learned to recognize thresholds beyond which force degraded rather than clarified. Within those thresholds, endurance was treated not as passivity, but as a controlled state with its own demands and risks. From this perspective, the fighter once deemed hopeless represented more than an isolated anomaly. It symbolized a broader adaptation to the realities of sustained conflict. It demonstrated that effectiveness was not solely a matter of overwhelming capability, but of strategic alignment with conditions that constrained both sides equally. The war continued to produce moments of decisive confrontation, and those moments retained their importance. Yet alongside them grew a parallel pattern of engagements that resolved without resolution, shaping outcomes indirectly. These engagements redistributed effort and attention, stretching adversary planning across expanded timelines. They preserved assets that remained relevant long after momentary clashes faded from view. In this environment, victory became less absolute, more conditional. Control was exercised through persistence rather than dominance. Influence accrued through survival rather than destruction. The refusal to dogfight exemplified this shift, not as doctrine proclaimed, but as behavior repeated quietly until it could no longer be ignored. Such behavior did not eliminate risk. It redistributed it. Endurance carried cumulative strain. Prolonged exposure tested material limits and human tolerance alike. Yet when managed within design parameters and disciplined practice, it offered steadier returns than cycles of escalation that promised clarity but delivered depletion. As these lessons seeped into collective understanding, air war evolved incrementally. The gap between expectation and outcome narrowed where adaptation occurred. Where it did not, systems strained against realities they could not force to comply. This divergence influenced not only tactical engagements, but broader strategic posture. The fighter that refused dogfighting thus influenced the conflict not through spectacle, but through consistency. Its presence challenged assumptions by existing intact, by denying opponents the satisfaction of resolution. Each return flight affirmed that refusal could be as consequential as confrontation when conditions favored endurance. In the fullness of time, such patterns rarely receive singular attribution. They merge into the background of operational memory, shaping norms without ceremony. Yet their effects endure, embedded in altered behavior and adjusted thresholds. They remind us that wars are shaped not only by moments of decision, but by accumulations of restraint that quietly redefine what decision even means. And in crowded skies where pressure surged and dissipated without guarantee, the willingness to persist without forcing outcome proved sufficient to alter the balance. The fighter had not needed to triumph. It had only needed to remain. In a larger sweep of the war, this pattern belonged to a broader transition taking place across every domain of industrial conflict. As systems grew denser, faster, and more interdependent, the promise that correct application of force would always produce resolution weakened. The air war reflected this shift with particular clarity. Machines multiplied, detection expanded. The sky became crowded not only with aircraft, but with expectations rooted in doctrines formed under simpler conditions. Against those expectations, endurance quietly asserted its relevance. The refusal to dogfight was not a single tactical revelation. It was an adjustment to scale. Air combat had ceased to be a sequence of isolated duels and had become a continuous system under strain, where every decision interacted with logistics, training cycles, replacement rates, and overall tempo. In such a system, survival acquired weight beyond the individual sortie. Each aircraft preserved carried future presence. Each pilot returned denied the enemy a definitive outcome and prolonged uncertainty into subsequent planning cycles. This reframed the meaning of control. Control was no longer guaranteed by forcing engagement. It depended increasingly on managing exposure, shaping time, and constraining the opponent's ability to convert effort into certainty. Systems built around decisive confrontation discovered limits when those confrontations could be deferred indefinitely. Pressure still mattered, but pressure applied without cooperation from environment or opponent degraded its own effectiveness. Across the war, similar dynamics appeared wherever industrial force met complex conditions. Sustained bombing campaigns strained interpretive clarity. Naval blockades imposed cost without always delivering finality. Ground offensives extended into attritional struggles where endurance determined capacity more than breakthrough. In each case, victory belonged less to those who acted most aggressively and more to those who could continue operating within deteriorating environments without exhausting themselves. The fighter that ceased dogfighting fit squarely within this logic. Its significance lay not in overturning air combat doctrine outright, but in revealing a boundary beyond which aggression lost proportional value. By remaining intact, By declining to supply the enemy with the engagement they expected, it turned absence into influence. It forced opponents to choose between escalation without assurance or disengagement without closure. Neither option restored certainty. Over time, these unresolved encounters accumulated into strategic pressure. They extended threat lifespans. They absorbed resources. They diluted concentration. They complicated planning horizons for forces accustomed to resolving contacts decisively. None of this required spectacle. None of it required triumph. It required only consistency and tolerance for strain. This tolerance did not replace courage or initiative. It placed them within a broader framework where restraint carried equal weight. It acknowledged that modern war rewarded those who understood not just how to apply force, but when force ceased to clarify outcomes. In that recognition, endurance emerged as an operational asset rather than a contingency. History often remembers turning points as moments of dramatic reversal. Yet many wars are shaped just as profoundly by quieter adjustments that redefine what success even looks like. The refusal to dogfight was one such adjustment. It aligned behavior with physical limits, organizational capacity, and the realities of prolonged conflict. It accepted ambiguity as unavoidable and used that ambiguity to constrain an opponent's freedom of action. In this sense, the fighter was never truly hopeless. It was misread. Its value did not reside in domination, but in persistence. It did not seek to end the fight. It allowed the fight to exhaust itself. When viewed across the arc of the war, that endurance mattered. It preserved capability where others depleted it. It redistributed pressure. It softened the assumption of inevitability that industrial forces carried into every engagement. And it demonstrated, quietly and repeatedly, that the ability to remain could shape outcomes as decisively as the ability to destroy. In skies defined by motion and intent, this lesson endured without proclamation. Survival continued. Engagements dissolved. Systems adjusted. And beneath layers of doctrine and expectation, war bent subtly toward those who understood that sometimes refusing the fight was not retreat, but alignment with a deeper logic of conflict.